Well, welcome to the Word at Work. My name is Nils, and I'm the senior pastor at Emmanuel Church in Belleville. We'd love to have you pop in. If you're ever in the northern suburbs, we'd love to say hi and get to know you. But thanks for joining us as we continue in the book of Revelation. Luan took us through the first couple of sections, and today we're going to get to the second letter that Jesus wrote to the church at Smyrna. Now, Revelation is a long book. It's 22 chapters long, full of strange and weird and wonderful things. But the first couple of chapters are very unusual. We have, in chapter 2 and 3, letters, personalized messages from Jesus to the churches of the ancient world. And if you watched the previous episode, Luan would have told us that these letters, although written to individual churches, are actually written to every church in every age. And they're written to try and help us navigate the hostile, scary, bad world that the rest of the book of Revelation goes on to describe. Now, let me just say, if you haven't got a Bible in front of you, why not just press pause quickly, go grab a Bible, and then we're going to have a look at this section together. So the section we're going to be looking at is in chapter 2, verses 8 to 11, and it's the letter that Jesus writes to the church at Smyrna. Now, what's immediately striking is that although almost every other letter contains a rebuke, in this letter, Jesus has almost nothing bad to say. In fact, he has nothing bad to say. Smyrna was a city of contrasts. It was a pretty exciting place to be if you were a Roman citizen. It was right on the Aegean Sea, beautiful place, paved streets, famous library, gymnasium, sports was big. It was a great place to grow up, a great place to be. But if you were a Christian, Smyrna was a tough place to be. You'll know that in the ancient world, perhaps, that the requirement of being a Roman citizen was that you recognized the Roman emperor as not just an emperor, but as Lord. In fact, you were to call him Lord. And so Christians were required to do this as well. And of course, that's just unacceptable for Christians who only worship one Lord, the Lord Jesus Christ. But there was another pressure point for Christians in this city. If you had to be part of the business world in ancient Smyrna, you no doubt had to belong to one of the trade guilds that operated within the business world. But these trade guilds weren't just organizations. They were associations that were devoted often to a particular god. And so each trade guild had practices and rituals and religious requirements, often involving sexual revelry as part of it, that as a Christian you couldn't possibly get involved with. So you had this pressure on you as a believer in the ancient city of Smyrna from the political world, from the business world. And the question is, what is Jesus going to say to a church that finds itself in that situation? What could he say to possibly help them keep going? Well, before he says anything, Jesus gives them a reminder of who he is. And we get a little flashback to the vision that John had in chapter 1. Each of the letters begin this way, as the church is given a particular snapshot of Jesus that they most need to hear in their situation. So have a look at verse 8 of chapter 2 with me. To the angel of the church in Smyrna write, "These are the words of him who is the first and the last, who died and came to life again." However hard it is for these Christians, Jesus is reminding them right up front that he is Lord over all of history. He is the first and the last. In other words, he was there at the beginning, he'll be there at the end, and he's with them at every point in between. Not a single life can be taken, not a single hair can be singed without his say-so. The problem is, of course, that sometimes he does let it happen. And so the question is, how can a victorious, all-powerful God who could stop these kinds of things happening to his people allow them to happen? And the answer must be that if Jesus is the first and the last, the Lord of history, then he must have a view of history and a plan within history that we aren't able to see, that we can't sense with our senses. And so in the darkest and blackest moments, as we live for Jesus, as we submit to him as Lord, this is a great thing to remember, that Jesus is ruling over history and taking history towards his desired goal and end. Look at what Jesus says next to the church in verse 9. Jesus says, "I know your afflictions and your poverty, yet you are rich. I know about the slander of those who say they are Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan." There are two words there that are so comforting to every believer in every age. Jesus says, "I know." I know. For the Christians in Smyrna, these must have really brought comfort to them because Jesus isn't unaware of what they're going through. Notice he knows three things about what they're going through. He says, "I know your afflictions." These are probably just the ordinary hardships that come from living in a world without the basic things that we take for granted, like sanitation and plumbing and insurance policies and Wi-Fi. The things that make life hard in the ancient world. Jesus says, I know your poverty, I know your afflictions. Notice he says, secondly, I know your poverty. Now, what he could be alluding to here is the poverty that resulted from them not willing to bow the knee to the gods of the trade guilds in the ancient world. That would have cost them economically. That would have had a big impact on their livelihoods. But as far as Jesus is concerned, if you're living for him, if you're investing in eternity, you're laying up riches that are far more incredible than anything that we could earn in this world. And so he says, I know your poverty, but that's not the last of the story. Their faith in Christ makes them more valuable than anything in this world. And then notice thirdly, he says, I know about the slander. Now, these Christians were having a hard time from the authorities. They were having a hard time from the business guilds. But for whatever reason, we're told here that there's a third pressure point that's coming on them, and it's coming from an unlikely source. It seems that other religious people are ratting out these Christians. The Jews, we're told, are not on their side, are giving them such a hard time. You know, as much as Christians are often given a hard time by the secular world in which we live, it is interesting that much of the opposition that we face that comes to the opposition against the true gospel actually comes from within the religious world itself. See, the religious are always as much of an enemy to Christianity as the non-religious. Satan uses them both. So the question is, what are these Christians supposed to do about it? It's all very well knowing that Jesus knows, but what does he say to them to encourage them? Well, what he tells them is that they have to learn to overcome the fear of living in this world with the faith of trusting in him. Have a look at verse 10 with me. Jesus says, do not be afraid of what you're about to suffer. I tell you, the devil will put some of you in prison to test you, and you will suffer persecution for 10 days. Be faithful, even to the point of death, and I will give you life as your victor's crown. Notice Jesus doesn't promise to end their suffering. In fact, he says you will suffer, you're about to suffer. But he does say you should not be afraid as you face the suffering. Do not fear the future, he says. See, faith says it may feel as if the present is dangerous and dark and the future is scary, and it is. But faith says, I know the God who has the future. I know the God who is in control of history, who is the beginning and the end, and I know what he is doing as he leads me towards that final goal. You know, fear is a real danger to Christians in every age. We may not have too many Christians in our own country who, out of fear, have given in or given up. But I suspect there are many Christians who, out of fear, have chosen not to make the hard decisions that show that they're submitting to Jesus as Lord. Perhaps Christians who, out of fear, have kept their jobs because they're not willing to make those hard decisions and stand up for what is right. See, we need a big view of Jesus if we're going to do that, because that is not easy. And here's the message that this church need to hear. The trouble that they're experiencing won't have the last word. So did you notice in verse 10, there's a limit that Jesus puts on the suffering that they're going through. He says it's going to last for, did you notice? 10 days. Now, I don't think these are 10 literal days. What we've got to realize in the book of Revelation is that the numbers are symbolic. And so 10, I think what it's talking about there is a fixed period. It's a period that Jesus counts. It's not 9, it's not 11, it's 10, an exact number of days. They won't suffer a moment more or a moment less. And on the time scale of eternity, 10 days is short, isn't it? Jesus says, even if you lose your job, even if you lose your family, even if you lose your life, the troubles and afflictions you experience are, as Paul says, light and momentary when weighed against the weight of glory that we can look forward to. And notice there is a prize at the end. There's a victory. Verse 10, be faithful even to the point of death, and I will give you life as your victor's crown. This is not a crown that a king wears. This is the crown of someone who's completed a marathon. They've come around the corner and over the finish line, and they get this wreath as a reward for finishing the race. Jesus says, this is yours if you remain faithful. And how do you remain faithful? Well, verse 11. Whoever has ears, let them hear what the Spirit says to the churches. You remain faithful by turning your ears towards Jesus and listening to what he has to say, listening to the way he interprets history, listening to what he says about your circumstances. Whoever has ears, let them hear what the Spirit says to the churches. To the one who is victorious, the one who is victorious will not be hurt at all by the second death. See, there is a death that awaits all of us. That's inevitable. But the death that we really have to fear is the second death. And those who are faithful to Jesus will never experience the effects of the second death. We will live in eternity with God forever. Now that's worth living for. Well, join us next time as we look at the next letter that Jesus writes to the church at Pergamum. See you then.